Hello. This is the 2025 statistics as presented to the 2026 Wisconsin Annual Conference. My name is Don Kramer. I am the statistician for the conference. I have been doing this role for the past 10 to 15 years in a volunteer capacity. I am a layperson from the Wauwatosa Avenue United Methodist Church. Today, I've got three goals for our presentation. First, I want to just go through the annual data collection process. I want to give some of the characteristics of the Wisconsin Annual Conference, and I want to describe some of the year-over-year trends that we're seeing. So just the statistics process, every year, every church by discipline is supposed to contribute their statistics from the previous year. Then each individual conference then gives their conference data to the general conference in the Nashville, the General Conference Finance and Administration, the GCFA, right? We then use those data to look at trends. We look at them to calculate things such as apportionments. Here in Wisconsin, we ask the local churches to have their reports in by the end of February, right? Here's just a look at where all the data goes. This is the North Central jurisdiction. This is the 2024 data. So you can see the 11 conferences that are in the Wisconsin or in the North Central jurisdiction. Wisconsin is listed there at the bottom alphabetically, but you can see that we're one of the smaller conferences with just under 400 churches and about 36,000 members. Again, all this data was from 2024. This was data that local churches gave to me, and then I passed it along to the general conference, which then compiled it for the whole denomination. This past year for 2025, we had about 376 local churches from whom I was supposed to gather data from. I say it's about 376 because churches open, they close, they merge throughout the year. We also have a couple ministries we collect data from, so they're not necessarily churches. So we have about 376 that I collect data from and then submitted to GCFA. Of those 376, 286 had their data in by the end of February, which is great because the more that get it on time, the less follow-up I have, less time I have to put towards tracking churches down. Of all of our churches, 18 submitted no data or just partial data. So then I ended up having to estimate their values. So there is some question of like, this isn't the most exact data that's out there, but it's pretty good. We had 95% of churches responding completely by the end. Prior year, though, we had only 2% not submit. So that sort of went in the wrong direction in 2025. Of our close to 400 churches, there's warnings that the system generates. So if there's big changes from year over year, the system generates a warning and asks local churches to explain why there was such a big change. So part of my process is tracking down those warnings and seeing like, are these reasonable or not? That's usually a pretty good way for us to make sure that mistakes aren't being made. So, but that's just is giving you some insight into how this data is collected and the type of work that's going on behind the scenes after the local churches submit their data. Just some characteristics about our Wisconsin Annual Conference. We've got 4 districts. I've got them in these pie charts, the distribution of churches and members by district, and in the pie charts, I have them situated the same way they're situated in our state. If you look at the yellow and the orange, those are our southern districts, and the green are our northern districts. We recalculated our districts a couple of years ago, so they're still pretty evenly distributed. Pie chart on the left shows how the churches are distributed. Churches on the right, or sorry, the chart on the right is how our members are distributed. As you tell by the state, it sort of follows the state demographics. We've got higher populations in the southern districts than we do in the northern districts, right? This next slide is a histogram. This shows our distribution of churches by membership. So the way we read this is that each bar represents how many churches fall into that that bin. And you can see the ranges of the bins along the x-axis along the bottom. So how we'd read this is that first bar showing us that there's about 75 churches with membership between 0 and 25 members. We're just under 100 churches have between 25 and 50 members, right? 16 churches have membership above 300, so they're off this graph. But I want to sort of focus in on here. If we extend the graph, we lose some details over here on the left. This graph is considered right skewed. So what happens is when we think of average church size, the average might be 93 members, but the median church size is 56. And so those large churches are bringing up our average much higher than what the typical church is experiencing. By median, what we mean there is 50% of our churches have fewer than 56 members, right? So if your church has 57 members, you are in the top half of the Wisconsin Annual Conference. So we are a small conference, and we're a small conference full of small churches. That's not necessarily a value judgment, it's just what it is. And so we have to consider that as we're making decisions and at the conference level and also at the local church level. If we're a bunch of small churches, then we're probably working, or we should be working closely together, trying to get some critical mass amongst our churches and amongst our circuits to make sure to work together more often, just because we're a bunch of smaller churches. Let's see. Another way to think about this is a distribution of our churches based on how much they are paying in salary and housing to their lead pastor. And so what I did here is I just added, there's line items for the lead pastor's salary and the lead pastor's housing. I added those together and then looked to see how they're distributed by churches. So again, the way we read this is the height of the bar is saying how many churches fall into that category. So you can see our largest bin there is between $10,000 and $15,000. So we have just under 60 churches that are paying between $10,000 and $15,000 to their lead pastor. You can see another large bump is between 50 and 55,000. That's right around the minimum amount for a full-time elder in the Wisconsin Annual Conference, right? So you can see anything that's above 50,000, that's a church that can afford a full-time pastor. Everything below that, churches are paying less than a full-time pastor. That doesn't necessarily mean that all the churches or all those bins to the left are representing full-time or part-time pastors. There's multiple churches that are multiple pastors that are serving multiple churches, and so then therefore multiple churches together might equate to a full-time position. Right. But this is, again, showing the distribution of our churches by how much they can afford to pay a pastor. Again, one more indicator that we have a lot of churches that are smaller. Right. This is sort of the same idea, just distributed, shown in a different way. This is a pie chart of how much the churches are able to pay, and I broke it up based on whether it meets the minimum requirements for a full-time pastor, a full-time elder, or a half-time elder, or quarter time, and then even less than that. So the orange indicates what percentage of churches are meeting the minimum requirements for a full-time pastor. So you can see in that left circle, the way we'd read that is 24.4% of our churches can afford a full-time pastor. 21.1% in the yellow can afford a half-time pastor. All right. So you can see fewer than half of our churches can afford even a half-time position. Right. On the right, I took the membership of those churches to see how they're distributed. So 55% of our churches, 55% of our members are attending a church with a full-time that can afford a full-time pastor. So again, this is just showing a distribution of how our churches are distributed and how our membership is distributed based on what the church can afford for a full-time or for clergy. Okay. Next, I want to see how churches are spending their money. So I looked at expenses and I grouped them together based on category. The two blue sections represent our personnel. expenses, which it makes sense that as an organization, we don't make items, we don't sell items, we are building relationships, we are interacting with the community. So about half of our expenses at the local church level are going towards personnel. The dark blue is our pastoral expenses, our clergy, and then all other staff is the light blue, right? The two red sections deal with our buildings. So the dark red is operations, which includes utilities, insurance, office supplies. And then the light pink is capital improvements. So that can oscillate or fluctuate year over year. In 2025, 11% of expenses went towards capital improvements. It's not always necessarily that high. Debt servicing, so mortgage payments and interest on debt was only 1.6% of church's expenses in 2025. The programming is in yellow, programming expenses. That includes education, worship, music, things go into programming in yellow. And then the two green sections, the dark green is apportionments and the light green is other benevolence. Apportionments, only 8.4% of our expenses went from the local churches went towards the apportionments to support the conference. 4.6% went to other benevolence. So this is churches indicating that they're sending money to their local food bank or general conference um, um, donations such as UMCOR, earmarking money that goes towards various organizations. That's the light green. That's how the money was how the money was spent at the local churches in 2025. This next graph shows over time how that's changed. Still the same color breakdown. You can see over the past, 5 or 6 years, pastoral expenses have gone down, that dark blue, which makes sense. We've had churches close. We've had churches go from full-time to part-time. So you can see that how we're spending money on our clergy and on our other staff has gone down. Operations has stayed about the same. You can see capital improvements going up and down based on, it only takes a couple big projects at a couple churches to really make that number go up and down. Nothing else I necessarily want to point out on this slide. The next slide then just says how things changed in the past year. At the bottom, I show that membership decreased about 5% from 2024 to 2025. Big changes there. Programming expenses went up 13%. Apportionment payments decreased 2% while all that was happening. Right. Then I also wanted to show how churches receive their money. This is a breakdown of revenue in 2025. The biggest component there is donations. 63.6% of revenue comes in the form of donations. This is tithes, it's pledges, it's unidentified givers just dropping coins in the basket. This is also, holiday giving too. So this is all of our donations. The local churches receive most of their revenue comes in that form. These cooler colors, the greens, the purples, all those grouped together we call budgeted income. So these are the means that churches usually can rely on year over year, what income they're going to receive. Fundraising is that light blue. Building use, that's regular rental use, but also weddings, parties, money that the church is taking in when people use their building, and then transfer of funds, usually from savings or from their foundation. That's the green. Those warmer colors, the yellows, the orange, the reds, those are more restricted giving or directed giving, things that make big changes year over year. So they're not necessarily classified as budgeted income. You can see capital campaigns are 2.2% of the revenue in 2025. Memorials were 5.7%, and then other designated giving is 10.7%. And that could include, memorials, someone giving money saying like this can only go to the music program, or it could include special Sunday giving. So if Golden Cross, that's designated giving, church takes it in and has to go out to that specific um, beneficiary. Also, if a church sells its parsonage, that money can only be used then for housing allowances for future pastors. That would also go in that yellow category of that designated giving. And that gray section then is all the other items that we don't necessarily know where to put them. So 5% in that gray section. Oftentimes that includes grants that churches are receiving. Um, because that donations category was so much bigger than everything else, I sort of had to break these down to show over time, over 7 years. The donations category has dropped from about 50 million to about 40 million. And that seems like a big drop, but also remember our membership decreased by about 40%. So it's a drop, but not proportional to how many members we lost during that same period. Other budgeted giving. Um, uh, this slide has some pretty interesting ideas here. First off, fundraising. You can see a dip in 2020. It's tough to have a spaghetti dinner when when we're not supposed to be gathering. So you can see a big drop during 2020 and slowly increasing, recovering from there. Still not reaching the same height it was in 2018 pre-pandemic. Building use stayed pretty steadily, right under $2 million, but then has grown in the last 2 years. And I don't know if that's necessarily more churches getting out into the community, getting more community um, organizations to use their building, or if that means that they're charging more for the current um, organizations that use their buildings. But we see a big increase there in 2024 and 2025. Transfer of assets, transfer of funds from the foundation, from savings, that has been steadily growing over these 7 years. Then all the other items I put together on a slide here, really showing how fluctuating they can be year over year. Capital campaigns dropping, but also now increasing. Memorials are really up and down year over year. Other designated giving can be pretty steady, but you can see a big increase in 2022. That again, it could just be one or two churches that can really make a big difference in that. And that other income also typically is pretty same year over year. In 2020, that's where we put all the PPP loans. So you can see a big increase in there in 2020 and 2021. Right. So that's how churches receive their money. Over the course of those 7 years from 2018 to 2025, membership decreased about 40%. At that same time, donations decreased 19% and fundraising decreased 21%. Building use was increasing 31%, and the transfer of assets really increased 163%. Right. So all that showing how local churches received money um, uh, over that time. Now let's just look at some other changes that happened in the past year. Um, this is the total church assets. This is the assets that are held by local churches. This is not held by the conference as an organization, but all the local churches. Land and buildings, this really increased with our changes in insurance. There's a lot of churches that have been looking at their insurance coverage and the values of their churches. So you can see a big change in that reported value. We didn't gain more churches. It's just, how we're accounting for the value of the churches, that there was a big increase there, really moved by the change in our insurance coverage over this past year. Right. And then I'm not going to read through all these numbers on the page, but showing some changes that happened in our participation. Weekly worship service has decreased 2%. Sunday school and VBS have also decreased, which is a worrying trend. Hopefully, it'll change in 2026. Christian formation groups, this various changes. Overall, the overall count hasn't changed much, but some breakdowns by age show some changes there. Fewer children, fewer youth, but then more adults. Is this also reflected to related to fewer Sunday school, and fewer Vacation Bible School participants. Participation in other things at the local church level, United Methodist Men, United Women in Faith, both increases in the amount of projects that they worked on. We also asked churches to say what types of small groups they're organizing, whether that's a continuous, ongoing small group or smaller, short-term, book clubs, Bible studies. And then United Methodist Volunteers in Mission, the number of teams that were sent out and the number of members both increased in 2025 over 2024. Finally, there's three things that I've been following for the past couple of years. Oftentimes, I have churches or conference members talking about how do we increase membership, and there's concern about how membership keeps dropping. I truly believe that that's just a symptom of other things that are going on, and things that we can't really control membership, but we can control things such as how we interact with each other and with our community. And the way we can measure that in our stats is number of Christian formation groups we have, the number of small groups we organize, and the amount of community outreach that we have. Of the churches reporting, 77.5% report that they have Christian formation groups. 73% report that they have small groups. 72% report that they do some sort of community outreach. It's not much different since 2024's report. Still on the classroom level, we're still getting solid C's. Right? If we want to see improvement in our membership numbers, if we want to see improvement in the type of difference that we're making in the world, I would suggest that we try to get these numbers up as a conference. Luckily, if your church is small and you're worried about how your church can handle doing all of those, we do have a system of connecting with other churches at our circuit level. And when we look at all of our circuits across the conference, 100% of our circuits, some church in your circuit is doing that type of work of having a Christian formation group, of organizing some sort of small group, and doing some sort of community outreach. So if you feel overwhelmed at your local church, at your small local church level, know that there's others in your circuit that are doing that work, and hopefully you can reach out to them and maybe work with them so that you can provide it at your church level too. That concludes my presentation. I'm grateful that you're watching this. If you need to come back, it's right here on the, the YouTube channel. If you have any questions, my email address is statistics.wisconsinumc@gmail.com. Also, we have half the year over. Spend the rest of this year trying to figure out how your church can do Christian formation, small groups, and ministry outreach. I thank you very much for your attention and your time today, and I welcome any feedback or questions that you have. Thank you, and have a good day.